Did you see this? Did you see this person getting booed?
No.
So there was this commencement speaker at University of Central Florida.
Oh, yes, I did.
Apparently, according to what we're seeing here, she is a real estate executive, which raises even more questions because I would boo a real estate executive just for existing, let alone for being a
Well,
commencement speaker.
and what's confusing is she was specifically addressing the graduates of the arts and humanities and communications schools. So you're kind of like, well, what does a real estate exec have to say to those specific graduates?
Well, let's find out.
Artificial intelligence is the next industrial revolution. Oh, whoa. What happened? Okay, I struck a chord. May I finish? Only a few years ago, AI was not a factor in our lives. Okay, all right. And now,
That's enough. Her unpreparedness for the students' like hostility to the idea of AI is just hilarious.
It's also great when she says, "May I finish?" because you can imagine this woman like then trying to start a career on like I was canceled by
Yeah.
being booed at commencement.
Well, there are people who would want to pick her up for that. So the students' hostility to AI and to the speaker is pretty familiar to me. I teach a course on the anthropology of art, and one of the things we talk about is the history of the idea that art is a unique human attribute. And I problematize it by highlighting how Enlightenment thinkers used to highlight, European art as superior to the art made by Africans or others as a way of suggesting that European culture is superior. And then we talk about, well, what else things can make art? So we had a conversation about, elephants painting. And then one of the students brought up AI. It was like, well, I don't think AI can make art because it's not human. And like in the conversation about AI, the idea of defending the humanity of art took on like real resonance for these students. Whereas like they could see that, yeah, maybe cave paintings weren't art for the people who made the cave paintings, and they're only art to us, and there's something about that being a problem. But like the idea that AI could make art was like a threat to humanity of some kind, and became a really big point of discussion in class.
No, I think there's a real anxiety and urgency among students, and
Yeah.
I see this with my so my students are all business students, and so they know that they're going to have a relationship to AI in the workplace, regardless of what their own personal beliefs and preferences might be. But I still see this real urgency and anxiety around drawing the boundaries of what are the things that AI can't do.
Yeah.
So they're very insistent, like AI can't think, for instance, even though it looks like it might be thinking, it can't, they're very clear, like it can't actually think. And at the same time, they'll say the problem is when we get too comfortable with AI, we let it think for us. And so it's like
Mm.
this simultaneous posture of like it can't think, but also some people are interacting with it the wrong way by letting it think for them.
Yeah. So today on Bad Art, we are taking on a zeitgeisty topic. We're talking about art and AI. You may have noticed that there are a lot of news stories coming out about artificial intelligence or AI art lately. Some of them enthusiastic about what art can achieve or AI art can achieve, and many others critical of AI's capacity and its impacts. So what we wanted to do today was talk about a couple of very common critiques of AI art. The critique that AI art somehow lacks humanity, and the other being that AI art is a copyright fraud. While we're sympathetic to the artists and others who make these claims, we find that these frames of critique contain some dangerous implications that the artists haven't reckoned with. So we want to talk about what we see as actually at stake in AI and AI art and propose some ways of opposing AI that don't rely on compromised arguments. So that's what we've got in store for you today. Thanks for joining us. I'm Colin McLaughlin-Alcock, here as always with,
Marielle Grushko, happy to be with you today.
and you're listening to Bad Art, the world's premier anti-art podcast.
So, Colin, for both of us, it is the end of the semester, and that means that we are in wading through a mountain of grading, or at least that's my experience of that
Yeah,
of the
mine too.
semester. So I'm done now. I finished 2 days ago, but part of my experience this semester and pretty much every semester since consumer grade language models came onto the market is I know I'm going to come across at least one AI generated final paper, sometimes more than that.
Yeah.
Never less than one, right? Whereas, when I think about my life before AI, I had many semesters where I did not come across a single paper that I suspected was plagiarized,
Right.
for instance. And so I think that's, from my perspective, one significant change is that I know now to expect at least one of these cases every semester. And so I plan for them in a way that I didn't necessarily plan for, you know, encountering a plagiarized paper. And part of the reason I guess for having to plan for the AI papers is because it's not as clear cut, right?
Yeah.
When it's a case of plagiarism, you can easily prove that it's plagiarism. You take it before academic standards. There's a clear cut procedure for dealing with it. When it comes to AI generated work, it is impossible to prove that it is AI generated work because it's synthetic text. We know that AI detection software is not very accurate at all. So my experience now is that every semester I read at least some synthetic machine generated text in the course of grading. And it is a soul crushing experience. And we can get into what it is about this synthetic art, synthetic writing that makes it so soul crushing to engage with. But when I think about the relationship between AI art and humanity, that's actually where my brain goes first, is not so much its implications for the humanity of the artist, but the implications that it holds for the humanity of the person viewing or engaging with the art.
That's interesting. So can I ask, what tips you off when you see an AI paper? What gives you the feeling that this is probably faked?
I would say that there's a smoothness to the
Hmm.
writing,
Yeah.
right? So first tip, especially when reading college students' writing, is that there is a level of polish to the text that most college students would really struggle to achieve on their own, but not exclusively, right? I do have some students who are genuinely really strong writers and could produce a text that's on the level of polish of what we get from AI texts. The difference then, beyond the level of just smoothness of the text, is the lack of underlying ideas. So my students who are very strong writers write their sentences and choose their words to convey their ideas. When I'm reading AI generated text, there's this polished writing, but it's really difficult to follow or even discern what the underlying idea might be.
Well, that's really interesting. So, yeah, so an uncanny, which I think is a familiar experience when looking at AI art as well, that it feels somehow too polished, too smooth, and also empty. Like both of these things together, I think are ways that AI is often categorized.
And it makes sense, right?
Yeah,
Because AI is trained on form, not on content.
right. It imitates form and predicts formulaic similarities. And that's why it's often so generic, if that's a way of phrasing it. Like It generates average probabilities for how a text or an image would look rather than
It's not so technically it doesn't generate average probabilities. It
sorry.
looks for the shortest lexical route between 2 points,
Okay.
right? So that's
Yeah.
part of the polish that we see is not actually a result of like averaging out a bunch of differences. It's that it's always taking the most intuitive step between any 2 points, whether
Hmm.
that's lexical or artistic. And so it makes your like if you're reading text, for instance, it makes your eyes glaze over because it's just like everything that's being said is like an obvious permutation on what has already been said and an obvious lead in into the next thing that's being said. And so at the end of the day, you're like, when is anything new going to be said?
Well, I mean, I've heard critiques that it's not capable of making anything new. It's not capable of generating ideas, and there's an anti-art argument, like it's not capable of making art, right? That its limitations are its reliance on that shortest route, that sense of familiarity, that this is what goes here, rather than there's a conscious idea of why to put something there.
Although I would argue when it comes to art specifically and thinking about art history, the idea that the primary virtue of art is novelty,
Yes.
and that art that simply repeats the familiar is somehow less. That's like a pretty new notion in the world of art.
It's a very new notion, and one that, if we take AI art seriously as art, the proliferation of it is something that is desired by its creators more than novelty and more than beauty, perhaps. But the ability to make it rapidly, easily, distribute it quickly, and flood us with it almost is one of its selling points more than, yeah, novelty, as we might have said before.
And also, like, I think for on the consumer end, people really enjoy the feeling that like they can create some version of art at the
Mm.
touch of a button or by putting in a prompt, right? You know, I think the idea that the AI is kind of a liberatory technology for creative expression is one that makes zero sense to artists and writers, but makes a lot of sense to people who struggle with making art or
Mm.
writing. And so there's, I think, a frustrating sense in which to talk about the implications of these technologies is to really talk across a skill divide, right?
Yeah.
And obviously, no one wants to hear like you enjoy using AI to make art or to write because you have a skill issue. That would be seen as like a very ungenerous way to talk to people about the issues with AI. But I also think that it's true. I see that my students, when they turn to AI for writing, it's really because they, not 100% of the time, right? I'm sure that there's students who are using it because they're in a time crunch or, you know, other reasons. But I think for a lot of them, it's that they lack confidence in their own
Yeah.
facility with the written word. And they feel because they see that polish to the writing, they think, well, I'm not as polished a writer as this machine is. So what's the point of me trying really hard to find the right words to say something when I can put in prompts and get words that sound like much more intellectual and
Right.
academic than what I could say. And so then oftentimes when I get AI writing and then I meet with the student, they're like really surprised when I say, you can just write the way that you would talk.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't have to sound fancy. You're not an academic. I don't expect you to write like the authors we read in class. And that's like a whole new idea for them. And I should say I've been teaching a lot of freshmen this year. I think by the time you're working with upperclassmen, they've assimilated that idea a little bit better. But definitely for college freshmen, they're reading all of this stuff that's super intimidating. And I think it does call up a lot of questions for them of like, what does this mean for how I'm supposed to, like, what am I supposed to produce in response to this?
Yeah. And that's a strong comment. That makes sense to me. we teach at very different schools, and in very different programs. And so I, so far as I can tell, have been lucky not to have had to penalize students for unauthorized AI use on their essays. Although I still am not done grading the essays from this term. But I have had students like who want to use it, and they're like, "Oh, let me use Grammarly to polish up my sentences." And it's that same thing. It's like a lack of confidence. And so telling that student, no, really, like, let's look at these two, write your own thing, use Grammarly, and then let's come and meet and we'll talk about the difference between them. But I think you're right that the thing that comes out is the student's voice is visible in some places and not in others. And you want that authenticity.
I think you're right. I think authenticity is a big part of it, right? I was reading an interview with Ishmael Reed earlier
Mm.
today, who at this point I would say is like a friend of the pod in some way because I feel like I talk about him so much. Uh,
We've got three friends: Ishmael Reed, Hillary Clinton, and who else? Sorry, no,
I don't know. Do we have three friends?
only two friends on the pod. Geez, that's bad. And one of them we don't like.
Ouch. Pod
Sorry,
needs more friends.
pod needs more friends.
One is a friend, the other is a frenemy.
We're in the middle of the podcast loneliness epidemic.
Yeah, no, Ishmael Reed.
So, so Ishmael Reed was in the New York Times today because he is writing a play inspired by the trial over OpenAI that's currently
Mm.
taking place in Oakland. So he lives in Oakland, and he thought that this trial happening to take place in Oakland is like a really good opportunity to skewer the world of these fashy tech overlords. So obviously I'm very excited for when there's going to be some version of this play that I can read. But in passing, the journalist also asks him, like, what is his relationship with AI tools for writing? And so he admits that he uses an AI program to remove extra commas from his work, which honestly, like, I could get behind that. I also overuse commas. But then he says that when he allowed it to do more than remove commas, it had way too many of its own ideas for how to change his writing. So the example that he gave was that he had used the phrase "hopped up," as in hopped up on drugs. The AI wanted to replace that with "people were sedated," and so just like the lack of poetry, right? And it's
Yeah.
part of this same idea of the shortest line between 2 points concept. But yeah, imagine if instead of reading that people were hopped up on drugs, you were reading that they were sedated. Totally different vibe.
Yeah. Did you see that Grammarly like briefly had this scandal where they allowed you to be coached by famous artists that were AI generated, so you could get like Maya Angelou's treatment on your prose, or I don't know who else, but like I mean, all the authors were super offended, or their estates were super offended, but you like there was this fake thing of
I'm just thinking, like, how would someone like Kafka have responded to this?
well, you can find out. Go to Grammarly and so we had a couple of like news articles which were in the zeitgeist which we wanted to talk about. And one of the ones which was like a prompt for doing this episode is this piece called Neither Governed Nor Free on Art in the Age of Generative AI by James Dusterberg in Boston Review. It actually appeared a couple of years ago, but it came through on my social media feeds via Shannon Mattern. And it's interesting. It talks about the aesthetics of AI, AI's uses and failings. It gives an insightful critique, but it ends by talking about AI, art, and humanity. But there's a big quote here which I think is worth reading and responding to. So Dustberg says, "There is one last human holdout. Even the singularity's biggest boosters mostly concede that AI cannot create real works of art. Since the Enlightenment, it has become gospel to think of art as a singular embodiment of the human spirit. Who would now deny, as one Global Foundation's website puts it, the power of the arts to challenge, activate, and nourish the human spirit? Then he goes on to talk about Kant's finding art as a source of like human connection and thought. And it is telling that even as art is held up as the last relic of the authentically human, it is being systematically eliminated from public life. Not only are the literature and the arts being de-emphasized or simply eliminated in high school and college curricula, but the only argument that is accepted for their possible relevance is their instrumental value for the workplace, where presumably they will help a new class of professionals ensure that machines run smoothly, feeding creative prompts to educate LLMs. What AI does is reverse the condition of art. Rather than owning our capacity to think, we place it in a box. So that's a long quote. I apologize for the length, but
That's okay.
I mean, I think there's a lot to respond to in there to the idea that art is the authentically human and that we're losing something human when we use AI to make art. Personally, I find that actually a troubling argument to make because of the ways that art being authentically human was used in the Enlightenment, which the author is citing Kant, but not talking about how Hegel, for instance, would say, well, you can see that Jews and Muslims don't make images, and that's proof that they are spiritually inferior. Christians who make images make higher art and have a closer connection to beauty and truth. And there's a long history of that kind of art being not just proof of humanity, but proof of the better art being better humanity, better art being European art, and other people being condemned to not being human because they don't have it.
And this continued in the War on Terror, right? Jessica Winiger has an excellent essay called The Humanity Game, which is about all of the efforts to hold humanizing exhibitions of Islamic art in the US during the War on Terror to show that Muslim people are also human because they create art. And one of the things that she noted is even herself, like when talking about these exhibitions or when talking about art for the Middle East, would say, you know, Arabs are not just terrorists, they are also artists. And so even in using art to convey that there is some sense of humanity in the Arab world that deserves to be protected, there's a cleaving off of another piece of that humanity, the terrorists who, because they are there, do not deserve the protection. And that becomes the vehicle for violence. So I think the point from her and the point from me is that, connecting art and humanity or defending art on the basis of humanity is a very dangerous game because there are always large groups of people who are designed to be less than human.
So what does it mean if our defense of art from AI is a defense against its inhumanity rather than like a defense of labor, for example?
Right. So I think what's interesting from that quote to me is when he points out the ways in which art has disappeared from our public spaces, because it gives me kind of a different way of reading the point about human expression than kind of the hierarchizing point about it. So to think about art in public spaces is to think about what kinds of controls are put on human expression. To what extent are we or other people allowed to create our own environments? Which doesn't just have to be through art, right? There are other ways that we can make our environments too. But art is perhaps a way that's easily visible, where we can see the role that we play in shaping our own environments. And as you said, it connects to this idea of labor, right? When do we labor as merely cogs in a machine, and when are we allowed to include something of ourselves in that labor? In other words, under what circumstances can labor be non-alienated? I was reading an article earlier today from like a tiny lit mag in Montreal, and they published a piece about old theater in Montreal. But one of the things that the author pointed out is it was built in the early 1900s. And as a result of when it was built, there's all of this, like, just like creative expression and artistry built into the theater. So the stonemasons who built the theater were allowed to carve motifs into the stonework, right? They're like flowers and organic designs that are part of the stonework of the theater. And it was just a point that the author made in passing that, like you don't see that anymore, right? We now have these purely functional buildings. And yeah, I don't know. It made me think about like, oh yeah, there is something lost when a stonemason is not allowed to spend the time on kind of those intricate, delicate parts of the craft because there's a foreman standing over them saying, you just have to like knock together this building faster so we can move on to the next one. And so maybe one way to think about kind of the creative elements, the humanizing elements of art is to think about the ways in which we show up in our labor. So
Yeah.
rather than thinking about like artworks, like Enlightenment concept of art for art's sake is one thing, but I think we can also think about lots of ways in which like tiny fragments of artistic expression show up in the work of craftspeople, for instance,
That's pretty interesting. So
which I don't think is the point that the author was making,
no.
but
Well, so I mean, it's funny that you pulled out that point about art being pushed out of public space because that was something I had something to say about as well. But I take your point that, most buildings are generally less ornamented than they were before. And certainly like theaters, are like there's a change in our methods of production of space often. Although I mean, I don't know, because there's so much placemaking going on. I say that and then I think about all of these fun parks in Philly that are like supposed to be like engaging creative spaces that are designed to look creative and fun. And, I have my own criticisms of them, but they've got like a personal touch to them in their making. So I
hmm.
don't know.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because I think you're right that when it comes to like landscape architecture, parks, spaces that engage with nature in some way, there's so much more room for artistic expression and play than there is in buildings. And then when you think about buildings, that there's really not, right? And in some ways that change from the building as a work of art in kind of the German tradition from the early 20th century where there could be a concept of a building as a work of art with all different kinds of craft integrated into it. And then when you lose that is really when you start seeing public art as its own separate sphere of activity, right? So the art has been taken out of the buildings, and
Mm,
instead now we have to put a mural on the side of a building or put a sculpture in the middle of the street because
mm,
the building itself is not giving art, so to speak.
interesting. I mean, it's definitely like true that a lot of public art is a response to brutalism and people feeling like these giant modern buildings were somehow spiritually empty, right?
And yeah, maybe the pitch that I'm making to you right now is like all of this is actually about alienation.
Yeah. And that makes sense. So I wanted to come back to like this art being pushed out of public view, just because like a thesis of our podcast is that that's not true at all. Like that there's lots of art in public for different purposes. But like, Trump is building this garden of heroes, like I live in the mural capital of the world where, many people invest in murals for various reasons, including real estate development. But like, every city now has a mural tour. The public art is everywhere. Lots of it is not good, but I mean, it's not pushed out of view. It's used for political purposes. And AI is used for political purposes as well, right? Like that the reason the right-wing fascists are into AI is because it works for them somehow to promote recognition, like you see AI art, oh, that's one of us. It works to promote a sense of homogeneity, linkage to the past. A lot of the stuff like buoys nostalgic images into the present in ways that work very well for fascism. So like there's a reason like people are latching and because they can't make art themselves, right? So like there's this effort to like seize the status of cultural production for the right when the right has not had it because they often are not good artists. All of that, like it is getting pushed on us in ways that this article denies in a weird way, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I would also add one of the other functions that AI art serves for the ascendant fascist right is that it puts their enemies out of work.
Hmm.
Right. So they
Yeah.
see that as a real benefit is so it's not just about them owning means of cultural production that they did not have access to before, but it's also about, in the bargain between labor and capital, there are certain types of labor that, in some small ways, hold power over capital. So, among them, writers, artists, scientists, high level engineers working at places like Meta or X, they are obviously labor, but they have a lot of leverage over capital. And one way that people have read the current moment is as a massive backlash by capital to 2020, right?
Hmm.
Suddenly feeling the ways in which labor was exerting leverage, whether it was in pandemic response, whether it was in the moment of Black Lives Matter, they hated that, right? And so they see AI as a technology that can remove that leverage from labor.
Yeah, and that makes sense to me. And we should be specific, like it attacks writers, because something that used to get like, especially boilerplate stuff, that used to get written by hand can now be written without a writer or with just an editor. It attacks low-level designers, like anything that is aesthetic, creative, but not high art is easy to pass off as content. Content making is something AI can do very effectively, even if it can't make good things. And so it can take those jobs. And I think it's very effective for me to think of AI as a massive assault on labor and on both creative workers and other workers. I think it to me it's more convincing to critique that than to like defend our humanity, because then what happens also when AI does perhaps one day make a Mona Lisa or something, like not just a facsimile of a Mona Lisa, but like something that like becomes like viewed as a masterpiece and it strikes our imagination. Well, it's still not good because it took those jobs from people who would be doing them. It's replacing us in some
Right.
way, and that's something that's worth fighting over.
Right, which is one way in which like the prospect of AI art that is actually good is distinct from the idea of monkeys on typewriters churning out Shakespeare,
Right.
right? Because on some level, like if the monkeys churned out Shakespeare, you'd be like, awesome, like yeah,
Right.
man. Um, multi-species literary communities, that's where it's at. And I think yeah, like there's a way in which we live in the world of the death of the author, and so I think a lot of people would be very receptive to monkeys that had written something on the level of Shakespeare.
I'd read
You'd read it.
it.
Would you? I think here's the key question: is like, would you stage it as a play?
Oh, definitely. If people wanted to give me money to stage a monkey written play, I'd be there.
Colin's your man.
Call me up. I don't have any stage experience, but I'm ready to go. I'll be at least as
Well, I
effective as the
guess
monkeys. And
right. Right, like similar to the monkeys, like maybe we get Colin and 100 other people who have never staged a play to all work on it together.
Fringe Fest 2027, y'all, it's coming. I'll just make it happen. It'll be a good defense of the arts because it will show how much like that trained labor is actually valuable, or not. It'll be the
Or
end
not.
or the beginning. Uh,
It'll be an interesting experiment.
yeah, so the humanity or inhumanity of AI being one big piece of the discourse. The other piece we want to talk about is theft. So lots of artists have complained about AI being a massive copyright violation. Obviously, how it works is by hoovering up a massive volume of previously produced written and visual works, and mapping them to find, like, as you said, what's the next thing in this equation. So to make probable guesses of what goes next to what until it creates images that seem likely. And so it hoovers up a huge amount of stuff that people have produced that they've not given permission for to go into AI art, and often imitates real artists who see their jobs being lost, now being their work that looks like theirs being made by AI. And so Molly Crabapple had a piece in The Guardian just recently called "Is AI the Greatest Art Heist in History?" where she talks about her own experience finding AIs imitating her work. And we want to talk about this because on the one hand, I'm very sympathetic to the artists who find their jobs being taken. On the other hand, I'm very skeptical about copyright as, you
Yeah.
know, something that can protect artists, given one, that most art is in some way derivative of its influences, and two, that copyright has often been used to punish artists, most notably Biggie, who's, has songs on his first album that you can't listen to, or the Gray album, which you can't listen to because they're made up of samples. And the idea that art is synthetic, it has to draw on influences. So copyright is also a tool that's used against artists.
especially along racial lines. And I'd be careful about using that as your protection.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think also when you think about just like sort of the shorter history in the 21st century of copyright claims being used to enforce like a more closed version of the internet against affordances of the internet that would have made things much more open. I think it's very frustrating for a lot of artists to have confirmation of what they knew all along, which is that it was never about copyright. It was always about power and
Right.
money and who had those things, right? So like I went to college in the 2000s. It was the era of LimeWire file sharing. And I remember, we were all petrified that we would get like a legal letter in the mail for our use of LimeWire for music file sharing. And there was a real moment where prior to the rise of streaming, you really could just like listen to music in a peer-to-peer distributed way. And the reason that that got shut down was, of course, not to benefit artists, even though it was. I do remember at the time that record labels would claim that this was about artists and their rights and protections. But as we can see, as soon as the music industry was able to get rid of peer-to-peer file sharing, they turned to streaming services, which are in some ways even more extractive of artist labor than the old peer-to-peer sharing model was. Difference is labels get a slice of the pie.
Yeah, and to add to that, the famous anti-Napster case like relied on Metallica, which, as a superstar band, they benefited as a label, not in the way most artists do.
Oh, that's interesting.
But
Mm,
most artists don't benefit from record sales, actually. They're kind of a promotion, or they didn't historically. So the record sale, the money of that goes to the label and promotes the artist, who would then make their money on tour, selling seats for concerts.
right,
So really, like, and this copyright thing is often get taken up like, oh, but you have to protect musicians from Spotify or from Napster or from whatever else. But that's never been how musicians make their money, especially not the bulk of them who are not the Beatles or Metallica or Taylor Swift. And
right.
so there's like, yeah, so copyright isn't the same kind of protection that people sort of think that it is for music.
Yeah. And the other case that I'm thinking about is Aaron Schwartz and JSTOR,
Hmm.
right? Where Aaron, I think he was at MIT at the time, and he bulk downloaded a bunch of JSTOR articles.
JSTOR is a digital library or really a subscription service that collects academic articles and sells access to them, mostly to colleges. So colleges will pay $1 million subscription fees to have access to scientific journal articles, which are otherwise kept behind this paywall. And Aaron Schwartz got in trouble for illegally batch downloading articles off of JSTOR to provide them to people for free on the belief that knowledge should be free.
JSTOR has changed Like in the last decade, it's given much wider digital access to articles than it used to. But at the time that Schwartz did this, I think the average price to access a JSTOR article was like $30 or $40 a piece, even going up to $60 for some articles.
I still see some, maybe not on JSTOR, that are like 100, without an institution. It's just like, it's crazy for stuff that people produce for free. So,
And for stuff that was produced like with government research
yeah,
funding, for
yeah,
instance. And again, they brought down like this massive legal case on his head, and Aaron Schwartz died by suicide, right?
yeah,
So this like really outsized power being wielded ostensibly on behalf of academics who wrote these journal articles, but clearly not really about them, because
yeah,
also like, yeah, like academics don't get any sort of compensation for journal articles, either at the time of writing or at the moment that a reader reads them. So,
yeah. And you know, so it's worth saying like who does benefit from copyright, because it's often said, the last 20 or 30 years have been the age where capital is dominated by copyright exchanges from patents and drug pharmacy copyrights and things like that. So there is, and in technologies, the tech sector is very litigious over software. So even though they can hoover up your paintings or articles and turn them into AI generated slop, they're very litigious about protecting their own proprietary materials. And I mean, one of the reasons that Biden didn't offer COVID relief to Africa was to protect
Pharmaceutical patents and intellectual property on behalf of Bill Gates.
and those are the people that copyrights benefit.
The drug companies, the tech companies, Disney, not the artists.
at the same time, I feel quite sympathetic to efforts to use copyright law against these big tech
Absolutely.
companies. Like just like what tools are available for artists and
Yeah.
writers? There's really nothing, right? And so, I mean, it's yet another case of our laws not really keeping up with technology, right? And so I get like people are trying to use copyright in creative ways, even if that's not historically who it has been arranged to benefit. And also, like, I think what's really frustrating about it too is that these are really clear copyright violations.
Yeah.
Like, by
Yes.
any standard that existed prior to LLMs, these are really clear violations of copyright. And so the idea that all of a sudden, that law just doesn't matter anymore, it's fucked up.
Yeah. No,
I agree. And, it's funny. We're definitely in an era where the law does not matter anymore.
I just worry what the consequences of strengthening copyright law rather than coming up with new strategies to defend employment in the arts.
Yeah.
Did you
Yeah.
want to share your story from your student research?
Yeah. So, one other thing that I've been thinking about with this issue of copyright is that copyright has always been designed, at least in the United States, to apply to individual creators. And so, that's actually that focus on individual creators is actually one reason that copyright claims have not been as strong against LLMs,
Right.
because it's very difficult to prove when the text or the art is synthetic. It's very difficult to prove the direct source inspiration from one particular artist or writer to the synthetic image or the synthetic text, right? Because what it's doing is it's really taking a mix of those different texts or images as influence and then creating something ostensibly new. But one thing that I learned from my students this semester, so my students were doing research about, so they're working with indigenous artisans, and one of the things that they're trying to figure out is to what extent, when indigenous artisans from elsewhere in the world come to sell their goods in the United States, what kinds of protections do they have for their work? So what they found is, frustratingly, that the answer is very few protections, because copyright protects, again, individually authored designs, right? So for instance, if if you have like a Navajo silversmith, right, for instance, who has drawn a design for a piece of jewelry and then created that design, yes, copyright would protect that design. And the Native American Crafts Act would protect that design. However, if you have instead a Navajo weaver who is weaving designs that she did not herself draw on a piece of paper and then
Hmm.
translate into a weaving, if instead she's weaving a design that has been in her family's lineage for generations, that would not be protected by
Right.
copyright.
So cultural heritage is not copyrightable. Community ownership is not copyrightable. Only the individual creation.
Right.
And that harms indigenous communities.
Exactly. Yeah.
One other thing which we wanted to hit in this episode is we've been talking about copyright. We've been talking about humanity of art. These are both sort of immediate things we experience in the consumer sphere of AI art or the producer sphere of AI art. But it should be noted that art is only a side effect of AI. Art is not what AI is created to do. And our AI does many other things, which we should also be attentive to. The biggest of those things is that AI is a military application. And that's one of the reasons why politicians have been so resistant to curbing some of the AI growth and data center building, because they're worried we'll fall behind China and other powers and lose our military superiority because we'll fall behind on AI. But what AI is used to do, we saw in Gaza, it's to pick targets faster so you can destroy more. Or we saw it like the bombing of that girls' school in Iran. It's AI targeting, speeding up the approval process for bombing and targeting and attacks.
And, I think with those military applications of AI, we were talking earlier about how people have kind of these folk theories of what are right and wrong uses of AI, and that generally a dividing line that people rely on when they're thinking through their moral intuitions about using AI as a consumer or as a producer. One of those bright lines is people don't want AI to think for them. This is sometimes referred to as keeping a human in the loop, right? So the idea being that there can be a workflow that involves AI, but there's always a human involved at kind of crucial decision-making points. But in fact, what we seem to be seeing with the military uses of AI in the past couple of years is that they actually are being used to remove humans from the loop. So the earlier moment of drone warfare pre-AI still relied on human pilots piloting the drones remotely and making decisions about targeting based on their judgment as humans. And the kind of core innovation of AI in this kind of warfare, the reason that it's able to make targeting decisions quote unquote faster is because there's not a human in the
Right.
loop on those decisions anymore, which is of course also how quote unquote mistakes get made.
Right. But which are attributable to no one.
Right, exactly.
As we were getting ready for this episode, I was thinking about Sam Harris's book on Palo Alto.
It's about the defense and eugenics being the groundwork of Silicon Valley and how
Yeah.
that's, like a better tracing of where Silicon Valley comes from to understand its politics.
And I assume the book is not just about like the latest turn, right? But it's about
No.
like that deeper history.
No, it starts with
Um,
like the founding
and
of Stanford to like make better
yeah, yeah,
horses.
yeah.
Yeah.
Right, right.
So, for most of the history of these tech companies, they were basically defense contractors. And it's only recently that they've begun to spin off consumer facing products.
Yeah, I think we have a recency bias where,
Mm,
for most of its history, Silicon Valley was about defense and eugenics. And then in the 2000s, there started to be this big consumer facing side.
hmm
And that was actually like the aberration from the norm, not what we're experiencing now, but also for those of us who were engaging with tech in the aughts and in the 2010s, we've kept that framing of the consumer side being like what Silicon Valley is about and what tech is about, and it's no longer accurate.
Or was never fully accurate. It's like a hallucination almost.
Okay, interesting.
There's a really interesting passage in Harris's book. So do you know why like the personal computer revolution took place?
Because Steve Jobs and Steve
No,
Wozniak were in a
no,
garage.
incorrect. So there's this deeper history of, as you know, computers used to be huge and centrally located. So you need like a whole building to to hold a computer, and computer scientists, et cetera, would like work in the building together, interfacing with a
Yeah.
machine.
My
And
hometown is an IBM company town, so I'm very familiar with that.
so these buildings were easy targets for activists, especially anti-war activists, to go in and just blow up the computer. So
Oh,
they were sabotageable during the Vietnam War. And so this led to the development of
wow.
individual computers so that they couldn't be sabotaged so easily.
It's
And
a defense in depth approach.
right, but then you have these individual computers which can be marketed as and developed by entrepreneurs, right? Entrepreneurs can say, "Oh, here's a thing we can do," and sell it to the individual household as like a family
Hmm.
tool. But it is again a defensive maneuver related to the Department of Defense that gets uh, individual computers into all of our households.
That's super interesting.
It fascinated me. I was like, wow, I didn't know that. But I mean, even,
Yeah,
you know, today, like the internet, the stuff that we get, like, oh, this is really consumer focused. We also know that the internet was defense technology that got made public and sold as like an extra stream of income for the companies that developed it, which developed it in a public-private partnership, but it was defensive technology until it became public. And that's how all of this stuff sort of gets rolled out. It comes from defense grants and defense financing and then moves into the public once it gets demilitarized or declassified.
Same thing is true of AI. It's a defense technology, which they're now trying to spin off consumer into profitable consumer applications, but the consumer side is only a side. It's only a side effect, and it's not the body of what the technology is about.
like the whole public conversation on AI is orthogonal to like what it's actually being used for,
Hmm.
right? And I think we can say like there's a really obvious reason that this is happening.
Yeah,
And it's that people encounter AI in their everyday lives. And so it's like very natural for them to organize the public discourse around the parts of AI that they directly engage with.
right.
But if you look at where the funding for AI is coming from, this is the part that's making money.
So it's a really violent, deadly technology, and I think we should criticize it on that grounds that it is a defense technology that we don't want. And if defense is going to be part of what it does, like that's as strong an argument against it as any copyright or any human truth. All right. Well, glad to say we solved it. AI is fixed, the world is saved, and I think we're going to leave it there. So thank you, everyone. I'm Colin McLaughlin-Alcock,
I'm Mary Grushko.
and you've been listening to Bad Art, a podcast about the politics of art in the 21st century. Thanks for listening. Please like, subscribe, review, etc. And we'll talk to you next time. Have a good one, everybody.